Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Unfortunately, I am doing this episode alone because of some scheduling conflicts. We should have GSP back relatively soon, but there was a lot of news to cover, and I couldn't just sit on it for another week because there's a lot out of the front lines in Ukraine. Of course, there's also a lot out of Europe as well. Big moves with Orban visiting both Ukraine and Russia, as Hungary is now holds the presidency of the EU Council, which once again I'll get into the details about the internal EU politics when we get to that. Quite a bit of news out of the Middle East as well. We also have the French and British elections, and I do want to discuss the prospects of Biden heading into the 2024 election and his performance at the debate, and the general loss in confidence in the public in Biden. What little was left seems to have mostly evaporated, but like I said, we'll get into all of that. So I will start with some brief Ukraine updates. You'll have to forgive me because my notes are not going to be nearly as organized as GSP's. He has a real knack for it. So I'm going to do the best I can. It's going to be a little bit bare bones compared to usual, but rest assured, I'll get you just the information you need to know and my take on it. But without further ado, we'll get right into it. So, just in the past week, looking at the second on Tuesday, we had units of the Sever Group of forces inflict loss on manpower and hardware on the AFU 57th, 115th Mechanized Brigades and the 113th Territorial Defense near Chumakovo, Yunakovka, Insumi, Solnitsky, Kazachok, and Lipsky, all in the Kharkov Oblast. And Kharkov is where you've had a lot of the heavy fighting, a lot of the heavy casualties, particularly because the Ukrainians are plugging the gaps there with manpower versus any armor or anything else because they have a shortage of that. So where they are holding territory now, they're starting to gradually lose it, but they have been holding territory at immense human cost, at the cost of a number of men, because they don't have the equipment or the equipment isn't serviceable or up to their standards in order to actually hold these defensive positions. But to continue, there were some Ukrainian counterattacks by the Vostok Special Operations Center and the 36th Marine Brigade. However, those were repelled by Russian forces. And on the second alone, the AFU lost up to 70 servicemen, one armored fighting vehicles, three MVs, one German-made 155mm self-propelled artillery system, and also one U.S. howitzer and another 122mm howitzer. Units of the Spad group of forces took it more advantageous lines and inflicted losses on the formations of the AFU 14th, 115th Mechanized Brigade and the 3rd Assault Brigade near Pershotravskoye in Kharkov, Nadia and Stelmonakova in the Lugansk People's Republic. Once again, I ask that you excuse some of my Slavic pronunciations. That's once again more of GSP's domain, being somebody who speaks a couple Slavic languages himself. He has a little bit of an easier time than my very limited knowledge. So once again, I'll have to ask you to excuse me on that front. So on top of that, on the second, there were also three AFU artillery ammunition depots were hit, and there was a counterattack launched by the assault detachments of the AFU 214th Battalion, and that was repelled. It's reported that the Ukrainians had also lost 635 more men, 2 AFVs, and 16 MVs. And just throughout the course of the artillery duels that have been taking place on the front lines, one UK-made 155mm gun and also a one US-made 155mm gun, one 152 howitzer, and another UK 105mm gun, and two US-made counter-battery systems were destroyed in the action. Uh, on top of the further material losses the AFU was taking, there were some ammunition depots that were hit on the second. And just going into some brief updates on the front line as of the third, In Zaporozhye front, the front line of contact is without significant changes. There's fighting on the front line, which is mainly positional in nature. Long-range weapons are actively working. On the Donetsk front in Konstantinivka, excuse me, the Russian armed forces continue to repel AFU, continue to attack AFU positions and push through the Ukrainian defense. And they're still active fighting, and it's a similar situation in Perskoyevka and Krasnogorivka. There is continued urban fighting with no significant change along the line of contact within the past day. And in Chasov Yar is where a lot of the action is happening. Fighting does continue in the eastern suburbs, and you have the Russians pushing further into the city. And in Kharkov, you have the AFU standing their ground, but the Russians are continuing to advance, but it's heavy fighting in Kharkov right now. Even though, like I said, probably the most significant front we could focus on today is Chasov Yar. There has been strikes back and forth, of course, more drone strikes on Crimea as well. The Ukrainians have ramped those up, as well as attacks on the Belgorod region. They did hit some of the power plants, some of the power grid, in which case there were power outages. And the Russians reported that it was actually improvised explosive devices, IEDs, that were at the substation, which indicates more sabotage than any actual conventional military action with that. Of course, the Russians did strike the Ukrainian airfields in Mirgorod, and they hit two Ukrainian Su-27s, destroying them and disabling four other aircraft. Continuing on, some more recent news as of the past day with that, just once again, just to cover briefly what's happening on the front lines here. But just within the past couple days, in Kharkov, the Volchansk front sees a high rate of fighting continuing in Korolenko, Sorbonaya, and the Gagarin streets. The situation in the town hasn't changed significantly. On the Solnitsky Kazachok village, partial occupation by Russian forces is reported but not confirmed. In the Bakhmut direction, which includes Chasov Yar, that's probably where the most significant changes on the front lines are happening right now. You have the Russian forces continuing to try to advance in the eastern part of the Kalinovka district and pressing into the Orlova tract in the direction of Servetsky, Donetsk, and the Donbass Canal. In the Toret sector, east of Druzhba village, the Russians have gained a foothold about 320 meters in, and in the Penichoye southern part and east of the village, you have the Russians occupying a sector about 1.25 kilometers wide and a depth of about 500 meters. To continue on, recently in Avdiivka, there has been Russian forces advancing along two forest belts near the Progress village. In the Sokol village, the remaining western part and the village of Vokzad have been captured by the Russian armed forces, and the Russians continue to advance towards Novosilovka. And in Ugledar, the Russians have gained a foothold in the Ikrankia beam, once again about 4 kilometers wide and up to 1.5 kilometers deep. And then, as the past day, July 5th, there were strikes on enemy depots in Odessa. This is a report from the Russian Armed Forces, just reading it verbatim. And Ilychevsk. An explosion was also heard near the Odessa airport, and secondary detonations were reported locally. To continue on, in Crimea, amid the missile threat, a bridge was closed several times during the night. Air targets were reported, and they were shot down near Berdyansk and Zaporizhzhia region. At night, the air defense worked in the Rostov region. 10 drones of the AFU were shot down in the Krasnodar territory as a result of drone attacks in the Primorsko Akhtars, and the reported casualties, about 6 people were hospitalized as most recent reports, and a power substation was hit, which did disrupt power to local residents. In the Kharkov direction, just to give more updates on that, the AFU took separate actions near Lipsky and Tikoye. There were radio intercepts from the Russians of Ukrainian radio transmissions that indicate a lack of trained personnel of AFU units in the direction, which is a problem you keep on running into with the Ukrainian forces. Very shoddily trained, and a lot of territorial defense units which aren't as well trained as what you'd expect for professional soldiers fighting in the war, and also not as well equipped. These are the guys who have been bearing the brunt of the meat grinder, who have been the meat shield, if you were to put it crudely, slowing down the Russian advances. To continue, in Chasiv Yar, the Canal microdistrict, remnants of Ukrainian forces were knocked out, and they're taking up defense west of the Seversky, Donetsk, and Donbass Canal. In Toretsk sector, the Russian armed forces are expanding their zone of control in the nearby villages of Druzhba and Kirovo. To continue on to southern Donetsk, in Krasnogorovka, the Russian armed forces are continuing the assault on the northern part of the town. South of Marinka, troops are on the outskirts of Konstantinovka and west of Pereskoyevka. Fighting for logistic hub continues between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. And finally, just more updates on Belgorod and Kursk, to sum up our brief update on the Ukrainian front lines. In the Belgorod direction, there were Ukrainian shellings of civilian targets, and there was a drone that had attacked actually 2 cars in a parking lot. 4 civilians were injured, 2 men, 1 woman, and 1 child. In Kursk, there has been intensifying strikes, and a Ukrainian helicopter dropped an explosive device on a residential house. A local resident was injured by the debris that was given off by that explosion, and they are attacking electricity infrastructure as well as agriculture as well. So they are taking the war once again more to the civilian Russian population. As we've seen, the Ukrainians are resorting to these terror tactics in order to, I guess, quote unquote, take the fight back to the Russians, because it's really the only option they have beyond any sort of conventional means, because of how much manpower and resource they've extended so far. So just in brief, I know, like I said, I apologize if that was a bit more disorganized than what you guys are used to and a bit more brief than what you guys were used to. I kind of had to put it together on short notice, so thank you for bearing with me there. The biggest shifts were Krasnogorivka, Toretsk, New York, which is the small town in Ukraine named after the American city of New York. Chasiv Yar and Pokrovsk is where we saw the main Russian push. And there actually is a little bit more of a narrative shift we have seen with this. And like I said, I'll get into some of the implications and explore some of the news outside of the direct frontline news in Ukraine in just a moment here. Where previously, whenever the Russians would capture a town, capture another settlement, it was always symbolic. It was the most strategic point in Ukraine until Ukrainian forces were beaten back, and then it became symbolic. They're not doing it this time. Particularly with Chasiv Yar, they are really pushing the narrative that strategically significant areas for the Ukrainian forces are falling. And with that, you could look at that 2 ways, in my opinion. And I think some of the other news we'll get into about Zelensky and about Orban as well will paint that in one direction or another. This is either a desperate plea for Ukraine for more help, trying to increase public sympathy once again, to convince the populace that we need to support Ukraine more because these strategic villages are falling. We can't let the Russians advance any further. This is becoming more and more of a dangerous situation, spiraling out of control. Or, on the other hand, it is to discourage continuing the Ukrainian war, continuing Western support for the Ukrainian war. Not entirely, but just to show that it is becoming a more and more futile effort as time goes on with that. And, like I said, it could be A/B testing, it could be putting that out there, seeing the public's response, the fact that they've moved away from that. Now, on the other hand, you do have, of course, more absurd claims coming from Zelensky that on the battlefield, casualties are 6-1 in Ukraine's favor, that for every one Ukrainian troop killed, you have 6 Russian casualties, and that the Russians are taking 1,200 casualties a day, are the claims coming from Kiev right now, are the claims coming from Zelensky right now. And this is also followed up by reports that Ukraine has 14 brigades in waiting, but because of supply shortages, because of aid shortages, because things were hamstrung for so long, at least according to Zelensky, they cannot arm and equip these men in order to go into battle. So you have these men who, if we're to believe the Ukrainian state, which I think that there's some major misgivings about that, these men are ready to go into battle, but simply do not have the resources for it. Now, how well these men are trained, if any of the indication we've seen from recent mobilization drives and recent Ukrainian recruitment efforts is any indication, then I wouldn't be too optimistic about how effective a fighting force these men would be, even if they were properly equipped. And what this does feel like is, once again, another plead for aid, that we have these men, they're ready for battle, we just need more money, we just need more equipment. And we just need the funds to keep flowing unabated, and Europe needs to step up, the United States needs to step up, we're concerned about Trump, we need to make our Trump-proof aid package, which they've been talking about for months now. And it's the next plea of the Ukrainians that, of course, we have the men, it's just that you're not doing your part, which has become par for the course when it comes to rhetoric from Zelensky. But more interestingly, in my opinion, probably some of the most interesting news out of Ukraine, up until Orban's visit to both Ukraine and Russia, was the reports of a possible Ukrainian default in August. And the Ukrainian authorities have reported, this was according to The Economist, that if they fail to reach an agreement with investors on debt restructuring, that it could cause quote-unquote severe damage to Ukraine's economy, which I do have to wonder what exactly they mean by that, because Ukraine's economy, they don't even have a war economy in the traditional sense, because they aren't manufacturing their own arms at that point. As to return to Viktor Orban, as he said, Ukraine is financially insolvent without foreign aid. Their economy is whatever aid that the West is pumping into them right now. Which is why, of course, a default, any sort of cutting of aid would be catastrophic for the Ukrainian economy. But, once again, to quote The Economist, Ukraine's GDP is a quarter less, shrunk by 25%, than what it was at the beginning of 2022 before the outbreak of the war. The debt level is about 94% of GDP, and you also have a complete destruction of the country's most basic infrastructure as a result of prior neglect from the 30 years before, as well as the increased damage, of course, taken from the war. Whether that be just because of further neglect or outright attacks on it, as we've seen, the Russians have been ramping up strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. And it's reported, once again, on top of all of this, there is a severe cash shortage that could also exacerbate the economic situation in Ukraine as well. And I don't think any of this is new news. I don't think any of this is shocking to anyone. The fact that Ukraine's economy has been artificially propped up for these past 2 years, even to the point where its natural resources, say its grain, its wheat. I know that the contaminated grain was the big issue between Ukraine and the European Union. You actually have the European Union debating on putting more restrictions on the import of Ukrainian grain in order to protect the interests of course, farmers throughout Europe whose prices are completely tanked by the influx of cheap and, mind you, very much lower quality grain, as we had about a year and a half ago, maybe a little sooner. Yeah, about a year ago, last spring, where the Ukrainians shipped grain that was considered contaminated under EU regulations. And with all of this, all the news that has come out of Ukraine in the past few days, there was speculation that there was going to be some sort of Banderite coup against Zelensky. Nothing of that ever came to fruition. I know that, speaking of coups, speaking of military officers, Sierski is on the outs with the Zelensky regime right now, and that it is speculated he is going to get the same treatment that Zelensky got. But the big difference is Sierski doesn't command the same respect that of the Ukrainian forces that even say Zelensky did. Whatever his faults were, he was viewed as a popular and competent commander by his men. Sierski is the butcher of Bakhmut, the man who sends his men into meat grinder after meat grinder, and he is losing favorability fast. And as for who his replacement would be, that is still up in the air, but it is speculated that continuing disputes between Zelensky and Sierski will eventually lead to another changing of the guard when it comes to the Ukrainian high command, which in a war like this, especially when it is as encompassing as it is the war in Ukraine. I mean, for example, the Americans went through about a general year in Afghanistan. And while that's not good, while that certainly did make the Afghan war much harder to win in a conventional sense, it was of little consequence considering the kind of war Afghanistan was up until a certain point, because of course our withdrawal was embarrassing. There was a lot of wasted money and resources and a lot of wasted reputation in Afghanistan, but when it comes to these smaller, I guess you could say, imperial engagements, switching out commanders, switching out the officer staff is less consequential than when your nation is in a state of total war, which the Ukrainians would, I believe, would claim their nation is in a state of total war, given the way that they are conducting themselves. That if we're talking in a period of less than 6 months, going through two different chiefs of the armed forces, it doesn't bode well. It doesn't give off signs of stability, especially when one of those commanders was much more pragmatic, was at odds with the president, and was well respected among the troops, and somebody that they could actually look up to, and who commanded their respect as his subordinates, as men who had to fight and die for his orders. Sierski commands no such respect. He's a laughingstock. I know it was one of Sierski's inner circle who, Sobal, I believe we talked about him last episode, who faced public criticism from Azov officers because of his approach to just the carelessness with the lives of Ukrainian men who agree with their cause or disagree with their cause, are fierce fighters. These men who are on the front lines, many of them conscripted very much against their will. Not that conscription is ever exactly voluntary, but to the point where they're thrown in black vans. Men who are, like I said, I think regardless of your opinion on this conflict, who are honorably and faithfully doing their duty, are thrown away at the hands of somebody like Sierski, who, hell, has no real connection to Ukraine as it is. Half his family is estranged in Moscow. His own stepson, has living in exile in Australia, has accepted Russian citizenship at the Russian embassy. That was a hell of a story back when it first came out. But this man is a naked opportunist at every opportunity. He's never turned up the chance to further his own self-interest. Whereas Zelensky, going back to him, you could say a lot about him. You could have a lot of criticisms levied towards him. But at least in my opinion, I think he was a true believer in the Ukrainian cause, that he actually bought into a lot of the narrative being pushed by the Ukrainian state, by Ukrainian nationalists, and saw it as his duty to lead his forces in battle in service of that. But Sierski, nor any of the other officers, the sea of names that you could get lost in, none of them command that much respect. Even some of the quote-unquote Azov officers these days don't even command that level of respect or had that sort of perspective on this conflict. It has become something of pure raw self-interest in this. I mean, it's a nation coming apart at the seams, as it is. The social fabric that was left in Ukraine is quickly evaporating, especially along ethnic and linguistic lines, as we've seen many times before. Keep in mind where many of these conscripts are from. Now, I know you're getting more conscripts from Western Ukraine, but keep in mind where most of the conscripts and most of the casualties come from. They come from Central and Eastern Ukraine. These people who in any other time may have considered themselves Russians, and who knows, depending on the outcome of this war, may consider themselves Russian in a decade or consider themselves more aligned with the Russians. Like I said, there's a lot of directions this thing could go in the loyalties and the perspective on ethnicity and identity these people could take a lot of different directions. They're right there in a borderland. There are mixed people between these two groups, and I mean that's part of the reason why they're throwing them into the meat grinder. They're making them go on these missions with a very low likelihood of survival, and using them as a human shield in places like Kharkov and just along the front in general. Because they have no respect for these people, they don't view them as countrymen. They view them as cannon fodder, and that will continue. And I can't imagine any replacement that Siersky would have, especially coming from appointment from Zelensky and his inner circle, would be any better. I don't know. Are they going to try to mend bridges with Zelensky, who the entire reason he was more or less sent into exile in London as the quote-unquote ambassador, was to avoid any sort of palace coup against Zelensky? Will they dig him up? Is it going to be that desperate? I know there's been talks of removing Zelensky, especially with the question of his legitimacy upon the expiration of his term, because he hasn't held an election since 2019, and his term was supposed to expire back in May of this year. So there are questions of that, and there have been protests from Ukrainians at home and abroad of the lack of elections, of the lack of transparency, of the lack of quote-unquote democracy, which they're allegedly fighting this struggle for survival in order to have a free and democratic Ukraine. Once again, not that I'm a bleeding heart about these issues, not that I have much stock or faith in the democratic system as a whole, but just to address these people in their own language, it's the suspension of our sacred values in order to preserve our sacred values. And they run into this time and time again. And yet it doesn't work, because these values that they claim are so sacred are very much temporal. They have no transcendent value, these people. It's always a means to an end. It's always a means to an end. Whether that is plundering Ukraine for all it's worth, giving its land to the IMF, making sure Ukraine conforms to the new American civic religion with the rainbow flags and the LGBTQ CIA nonsense. Once again, all the stuff that we've covered before. Like I said, there's always something else. The freedom and democracy, those platitudes are never the core issue. Because when it comes to the will of the people, they could care less about that. When it comes to the freedom of the Ukrainian people, you cannot tell me that they give a damn about the freedom of the Ukrainian people. I know I'm treading ground that has been tread by this show already and by many others, but I think this is one of those things that bears repeating. They could not give less of a damn about the democratic will or the freedom of the Ukrainian people. And they've outright said it. You had Lindsey Graham as probably the worst offender, Nikki Haley. A lot of the, let's just say, bad optics neocons within the United States have said, well, it's a good thing Ukrainians are dying, so we don't have to do it. It's a good thing that they're bearing the brunt and fighting and killing the Russians. Their words, not mine. Their words, not mine. And that is the fight for freedom and democracy that we've been told is so vital for Ukraine. Now, I think anyone who's honest about it could see that, yes, this is, of course, a geopolitical struggle. Yes, of course, this is yet another game of global chess, as I suppose Brzezinski would have put it. And maybe you could say it's even more respectable that a lot of these neocons are coming out and saying this outright. And he might have a point from raw self-interest if you could point to me the raw self-interest of why we need Ukraine to serve as this battering ram against Russia, as to why Russia needs to collapse, and give me a solid reason that isn't just the preservation of liberal hegemony, which is what all their arguments boil down to. They'll throw in the token security argument here and there, but ultimately it's always a threat to the security of liberal hegemony, not the actual American nation insofar as it still exists, because once again, very dire straits in this country. I don't think anyone would deny that. Not the fate of the collective West or European security in any real substantial terms, beyond once again the fact that quote unquote liberal democracy needs to reign supreme anywhere and everywhere. But I'm getting off too far off on track with that. So I want to get back to Orban and his diplomatic maneuvering now that Hungary holds the presidency of the EU Council. And it is a 6 month rotating position between European Union member states where every 6 months a new country will be appointed to that council. The governing party, the governing cabinet, the president, the prime minister, whatever the local political system happens to be, get to set the agenda for the European Union, more or less for the next 6 months. And there's other king-making duties that they have there, and it's more of a position of influence than any raw power. But right now, as far as the quote-unquote institutions, as far as the world is concerned, the Hungarian government is speaking for the European Union as a whole. And Orban's first agenda item, even beyond migration, which he has made his name being a firebrand against migration, much to his credit, there's been some pitfalls here and there. There's been some quote-unquote legal migrants that have presented some issue where he has gone back on his promises with some of that, which he certainly deserves criticism for. But focusing on the primary issue at hand right now, his first order of business has been a visit to both Kiev and Moscow in order to facilitate the peace process in a way beyond what most European talking heads say, in much a substantial way. So Orban goes to Kiev earlier this week, and at first when I saw this, I was rather concerned that they had compromised him. I was rather concerned that he was going to go over there, he was going to renege on a lot of Hungary's positions, and say, well, of course we still support the peace process, we understand the need to continue making sure the European institutions, the European Union, stands behind Ukraine in this time of Russian aggression, blah. Maybe I've grown too pessimistic, but I did genuinely fear a statement like that was going to come. But instead, he did go over. He raised the issues of the Hungarian diaspora in Ukraine, which is an issue that he's been hammering on for a number of years now. Actually, even going back before the 2022 Russian invasion, he had been addressing the issue of the Hungarian diaspora and their rights in Ukraine since they tried to force through the language law. I believe it was in 2018 is when the debate around the language law in Ukraine really picked up. So he did bring up that issue. And he also brought up the issue of a comprehensive peace plan to Zelensky. It was a very cold, intense meeting. You could look at the joint press conference, the way they looked at each other. You could look at just... I hate to get into body language analysis because I know the mainstream media likes to assess on that, but you look at the dynamic between these two men. This does not look like a friendly or productive meeting, even on a professional level. I'm not saying that these people have to, let's say, relate to each other on a personal level. Now, that oftentimes does happen. You do see this occasionally. In fact, even before the war, you had a lot of this with Putin and Merkel in the late 2000s and early 2010s. But even just speaking from a professional level, two men representing their nations, there was an ocean-sized rift between them. And anyone who looked at it just for 5 seconds could tell. Zelensky more or less hand-waved away any Hungarian suggestions and continued on with pushing the same narrative that he has been advocating for years now, which is Russia concedes on everything, they withdraw all their troops, and then we can begin a negotiation. So the trip ended in very much short order, and during the same time there were rumors coming out based on some statements from Peter Szijjártó, who is Hungary's foreign minister, about a potential visit of Viktor Orban to Moscow to meet with Putin to discuss peace on the other side of the issue. Because since the outbreak of this war, Hungary has been the most consistent voice in wanting an actual brokered solution to this war that took into account security of both parties and of Europe at large, which also spans the world, including the United States within the European security infrastructure. Going back to an interview Orban did with Tucker Carlson. I believe it was last November. A lot of it was boilerplate. A lot of it was just the standard right-wing talking points, like Hungary stands up for its culture, and we make sure we don't have migrants, and we make sure that we respect traditional values, etc., etc. But when they got into the issue of Ukrainian peace, he took a much more, let's just say, serious tone in that regard, talking about how Russia does need to be integrated in the European security infrastructure, that there needs to be a comprehensive understanding between Russia and the United States, and that negotiations to end this war in Ukraine have to take place between particularly the United States and Russia, because they are the two primary parties in this war. Ukraine just so happens to be the Ukrainians just so happen to be the one doing the fighting and dying, which even for a Western leader on the fringe was still a major gap for a Western leader to cross. Like I said, this is going back to the I believe it was November 2023 interview. It may have been earlier, but I know it was late 2023, the interview between Tucker Carlson and Viktor Orban. But now that a position of greater power and influence has fallen on the shoulders of Hungary, and look, it's going to be short-lived. It's only 6 months. It's only to the end of the year. And he's only just begun this position. The Hungarian government has only just begun this position as holding the presidency of the European Union Council. So we could see. I don't want it to happen, don't get me wrong. I don't think I need to clarify that to anyone, but just to have on record. We could see some capitulation on these issues if there's enough internal pressure on Hungary due to this, because there's been uproar among the usual suspects, the van der Leyen, Stoltenberg, who was outgoing. Stoltenberg outright saying, we can't accept any peace, NATO won't accept any peace that sees Ukrainian territory ceded to Russia, as if he has any, at least formal say in this, which, I mean, he has a huge informal say in this, don't get me wrong. But that's what he continue on, and a lot of just like I said, the usual suspects in Brussels were outraged about this trip. So just in brief, the meeting between Putin and Orban, it did look like the men had a very good professional relationship when Orban was greeted in Russia. He actually had a welcoming party. Putin met him personally. They met, shook hands, did the photo op. Once again, it looked like two friendly nations meeting with one another. And then it continued on. The pleasantries were exchanged. All the diplomatic formalities were put out of the way. And when it came to the peace talks, just in brief, Putin's main points were Ukraine is against a ceasefire right now in this war because it would end the pretext for martial law, which would end the pretext for Zelensky being in power and that they have to hold elections. That there should not be a truce or pause for the additional armament of Ukraine, and that Moscow and the official position of Moscow is a permanent solution to this conflict, a comprehensive peace, that it's not just going to be a ceasefire so they can kick the can down the road and address this again in 5 years, that they want a fleshed out peace agreement if they're going to continue with this. Russia insists once again on the withdrawal of all Ukrainian forces from the oblasts that were annexed into the Russian Federation last fall, actually fall of 2022, excuse me, including Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, calling for the complete and total Ukrainian withdrawal from those oblasts, and that despite the difficult situation, it is important that dialogue continues, particularly between Moscow and Budapest, were the main points that Putin had made in the conference. The main points Orban has made is the position of Russia and Ukraine are very far from each other. Much needs to be done to bring the end of the conflict closer. He said he discussed with Putin the achievement of peace in Ukraine, the shortest path to this. The conflict has also had an impact on the European economy and its competitiveness, and that he discussed existing peace initiatives with Putin, the potential ceasefire, potential negotiations, and what the general vision of Europe is after the war, and that he promised on his end, both as Hungarian Prime Minister and Hungary having its position as president, as holding the presidency of the European Council, will continue to work towards peace efforts. And really, in my opinion, what we saw from Orban was the rational European position, was what one reasonably would have expected if Europe was an actual sovereign continent that was able to call its own shots, that was able to stand on its own and have the so-called strategic autonomy that Macron constantly babbles on about, that isn't just raising up more French forces so we can fight a war on behalf of the Atlanticists, the fake strategic autonomy that Macron wants you to think, or whatever souped up term he's putting his neoliberal slash neoconservative, his pro American empire policy, we'll put it that way, towards Europe, towards Ukraine. But no, what we saw from Orban is what, like I said, whether you agree with his domestic policies, whether you agree with his migration policies, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of European Russian relations, it was probably the most sane you're going to get for a very long time. And I hope that in this 6 months, in this very brief window, while Hungary does have control of the narrative to a degree within the European Union, has control of the European institutions to a degree, that they can begin working towards making more concrete agreements with Russia to diffuse tensions and to hopefully mend the, once again, ocean sized rift that now exists between Europe and Russia, because the Europeans as a continent, in terms of their economic prosperity, in terms of the way their economies are structured, they need access to the Russian markets. They need access to the Russian raw resources. And that Europe is hurting without it. Europe is atrophying without access to these Russian resources, while Russia is doing just fine. It has partners elsewhere. It can go to China, it can go to India, and worse yet, Europe is still receiving these Russian resources through third parties who are charging them a massive premium. So, just pragmatically speaking, Orban is probably doing the absolute best thing he can by standing in Moscow with Putin, talking to the quote unquote enemy to try to reach a reasonable and lasting solution to this that doesn't involve the complete dissolution of Russia and the massive instability that would come from that. And even with all of this, going back to some news out of Ukraine, you now had the Europeans and some parts of the American establishment getting cold feet about Russia, the Ukrainian strikes into Russia, because they feared of the destabilization efforts, and that would lead to a fracturing in Russia, and that they're not prepared to deal with the consequences of what a more divided Russia would look like. So there is, I guess, some degree of pragmatism setting in on both sides of the Atlantic. We'll see if it lasts. I think the ideological radicals are a bit too well entrenched for something like that to be taken into consideration. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think if the past 8 years, and especially the past 2.5 years, show us anything, is that these people wield a massive amount of power and influence, and they will use it to their own ends, even if it means the detriment of a significant part of the world. And in fact, you could even say most of the world at that point, beyond a small circle of them and their associates. But I want to be optimistic about Orban crossing that bridge and being the first European leader, being the first quote unquote Western leader, because once again, I know Hungary and the West, there's a little bit at odds there, to actually cross that bridge and meet with Putin. And everything Orban said, I know that when he was in Ukraine, he said we're not pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine, we're pro-Hungary, which, once again, a very reasonable position. He represents a large swath of the European population, especially within Central and Eastern Europe, who want the benefits of integration with the West, and particularly the economic prosperity, which is admittedly starting to dry up because of the economic hardship of the past 4 years, while also having access to the Russian and Chinese markets and being able to reap the benefits of both in their, let's just say, very comfortable strategic position right in between those two worlds. I mean, that's a deal Ukraine could have had if we look at the way things were going before the Maidan. And I don't know, maybe that would have been a net negative for Russia. Maybe it's a good thing that actually it played out this way, so Russia could actually assert itself over its former territory in Ukraine. Uh, I suppose that would be a question for the people of Russia, and I know that from the ones I've talked to, they would give probably varying answers on that, and Some view this war as, I don't want to necessarily say a good thing, but the preferable alternative to the more, let's just say, diplomatic approach Putin was taking before this. Like I said, there's a lot of varying perspectives on Russia about this war in particular, and whether it was something that could have been prevented, whether this is something that was, like I said, I don't necessarily want to say desirable, but preferable to the more diplomatic alternative. Some people think Putin's still too conciliatory, etc., etc. But I'm getting off track. But like I said, Hungary, Orban, representing a very key position in Europe that encompasses, I don't want to say a majority of the population, but a significant chunk of the population, yet when it comes to its politics is perpetually underrepresented, which is the people want to be on good terms with both sides. Like I said, a completely reasonable position to take, and a position that you're starting to see a coalition of right-wing parties across Europe, because within the European Parliament, Fidesz, which was expelled from the center-right coalition in the European Parliament, has formed its own faction, and they're courting the Lega Nord in Italy, Lega Nord, excuse me, the Czech right-wing party, the National Rally in France as well, in order to build a new right-wing coalition within the European Parliament. And that will continue even beyond the Hungarian presidency of the European Council. And like I said, it consists of a lot of more pragmatic views, especially on the foreign policy issues. Like I said, these groups have a lot of pitfalls. You get to get into those and dissect those day in and day out. I have before, we have before on this show. But I'm not going to get that deep into it right now because I want to wait and see what actually happens. And maybe I'm making the fatal mistake of having some optimism about the situation, but I think this is the most likely opportunity we're going to get to a global detente on this sort of situation. And will the world be wise enough to take it? I fear not, but this is, like I said, this is our non 0% chance for this thing being diffused and ending in a much more calm and measured manner versus the risk of escalation, which this very easily could take in the near future. So I do generally hope and pray that it does open the door for some sort of comprehensive peace that isn't just Washington dictating terms, and that actually does address the concerns of European security and global security as a whole, in order to create, once again, a more peaceful world. And some might say that's idealistic, some might say that makes me bleeding heart. But no, I generally do want this major war to stop, because this is, I mean, death and bloodshed on both sides here. It's not something I rejoice in. Despite my position that I think the Russians have a much more reasonable case, and dare I say, even have my sympathy in this conflict, just overall, on a global level, I do think that this war needs to come to an end before it spirals out of control and drags the rest of the world down with it. And like I said, I hope this is the beginning of that. I hope this opens a door in order to have a much more peaceful and stable continent, a much more peaceful and stable world for that matter. But we'll have to wait and see. But to continue on any potential for peace talks, Putin also said, because he was in Kazakhstan before this visit, meeting with the Kazakh government, just part of the routine meetings that they do in the lead up to the, particularly the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, both which they're part of, where when he was asked about at a press conference about Trump's desire at forming a peace plan, he said he's open to it, yet has not heard any details. So you also have Putin once again reaching out with the olive branch, being conciliatory. Some may say too conciliatory, and also the question of whether or not Trump could actually usher in some sort of peace. And even with that, there simply wouldn't be that window for Europe and the U.S. to be in concert, even assuming Trump were able to accomplish what he wants to, assuming the best about Trump, that he's serious about what he's saying, and that he was also able to get people in the positions of power, particularly in the State Department, in order to actually implement his policy and not fight him every step of the way, aligning with a pro-détente faction in Europe. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not very likely, unfortunately. And I do think that it will just lead to more gridlock, will lead to more stalemate. But hopefully, as the situation gets worse, it does lead to more reason prevailing. And perhaps I just sound just foolishly optimistic even saying that. I don't even believe it myself, but hopefully it leads to some sort of sense of what's really at stake here, and that even with parties you wouldn't expect, that they would be more amenable to a comprehensive peace, working on previous agreements, whether that be Minsk or Istanbul or any of the other backdoor negotiations that have taken place involving Russia and Ukraine in the past decade. But like I said, a lot of it is just having to wait and see. A lot of it is speculation, but very encouraging at least to see Orban and Putin meet and discuss these issues on a very real level. Now, with that, just some brief news in the energy sector. The EU is considering the possibility of a new contract with the Russian state energy agency of Gazprom to supply gas to Europe. Which, like I said, it's not like they've been deprived of European gas. They've just been paying deprived of Russian gas in Europe. They've just been paying a premium via third parties such as China, Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the usual suspects here. Turkey, another one. And the Russians have also said that they are moving towards more energy independence, and I mean, once again, massive energy producer. But in terms of the energy infrastructure that they're producing, they by 2027 want to have a completely self-sufficient energy industry, and that was the goal that was laid out by, I believe, Medvedev going forward. So we do see once again more. I know nationalization carries a certain meaning, and that the word has a meaning, but let's just say a more deglobalization of the economy when it comes to nations taking more control over their economy in a sovereign sense, having more control over their industry and resources. We are seeing a move towards that, in a large part spurred on by the Ukraine war, because it has broken global supply chains. And that was the second hit after COVID had shut them down for about a year and a half. And that you are seeing a return to more regionalized economies and more national economies versus global economies. And that has its ups and downs. I do think that there's a lot of benefit to be had. And I do think that in terms of some of the social corrosion, that it can also mitigate that as well. But I know there's also a lot of economic integration going on right now, say the expansion of BRICS. And who knows what BRICS will look like in 10, 20 years' time. Perhaps it will succumb to many of the same issues that the current economic order has, but one might hope, and like I said, perhaps I'm foolishly optimistic, that with a less globally centralized economy, that it does prevent some of those issues, even at the cost of some, on paper at least, economic prosperity. And like I said, I have no illusions about BRICS being an altruistic organization. There are few, if any, of those in any realm of politics, but just through pragmatism, just through the reality of the situation, one can hope that because of that, it doesn't fester exactly into what the current global economic system has, and avoid those pitfalls. And perhaps it'll have its own unique problems that will need to be addressed at some point. Almost certainly will. But for the time being, we can hope that nations, individual nations, and regions, regional blocks, treaties between two nation states and not these behemoth organizations or smaller, more regional organizations can prevail over the current decrepit system. Like I said, I'm sure there'll come a time in the future when these new organizations that are forming will also need to clean house, and something will need to come along to replace them to clean the slate so we can get rid of the graft and corruption and the inefficiency of those systems. Like, everything has a shelf life. It's just that simple. So I don't mean to come off as a shill for really one side or another. I have my views, I have my perspectives, I have my beliefs on these things. And while, yeah, one could say, as I'd said before, I do have a great deal of sympathy for the current struggle the Russian nation and people are going through and what they're trying to accomplish right now. And I in no way view it as a threat to my life or livelihood or the livelihood of my nation in a real sense, and not talking about the liberal hegemony sense. Like I said, but all those systems are just as liable to corruption and decay as this are. And who knows? Maybe they'll build a more sustainable system. One could hope that they do. Maybe they'll have something with more longevity, something that perhaps aligns more with my values and can project that out in the world. Like I said, we're speculating far too much beyond down the road here, but I do think it's a positive development that we are getting a shift away from the current global economic system, and that look, yeah, perhaps it could get worse, but it's uncharted territory, and it gives us the opportunity, on an individual level, national level, even subnational level, say state, local government, etc., to forge a new path, to break free of this system that, look, this current system is clearly not working, therefore we must find something else, we must try something else. No guarantee that'll work, but we can either continue to flounder or we can take a leap into the unknown and hope it works better. And I can tell you, I would rather take the non-0% chance of some sort of success than continuing on with the slow and painful decline that we have right now. But with that being said, I apologize if that was too much of a tangent. I want to cover the other big elections that took place this week and a half, in France and the UK. So, in France, you had the first round of elections, which saw the collapse of the center. It was beautiful. Macron's party came in third after the National Rally, the Front National. I know that a lot of these parties have to change their names for legal reasons and campaign reasons every few election cycles, but National Rally under Le Pen, and the left-wing coalition, the New Popular Front under Mélenchon. Forgive me for any bastardized French pronunciations. I do not speak French, so like I said, forgive me if I butcher any of this. But there was some interesting election data. Now we've only had the first round of elections, which the way it works is the French election system is built to weed out the quote-unquote radicals by having the first round, and the candidates that fail to cross a certain ceiling are barred from the second round of elections. And I believe that's 15%, somebody can correct me. So every candidate that got above 15% can stand again, and then the winner of the plurality of those votes obtains the seat, obtains the office. But to take a look at some of the data from the elections we have right here, in the top left we have the votes broken down by age in France. So you look at the youth vote, it did largely go to the New Popular Front, it did largely go to the left. But the next strongest opposition for the 18 to 24 was among the right, was 33% for the National Rally. Very similar figures with the 25 to 34 and the 35 to 49. And you don't really see the centrists start to make a gap until you get into the section of the population that's about 50 years or older. And the only place where the centrists actually command a lead is among the 70+% population. And very similar with social class, right here, looking at the bottom right, people of a disadvantaged class overwhelmingly are voting for the right, particularly on the issue of migration. Working class, once again, voting overwhelmingly for the right, particularly on the issue of migration. You have some leaning towards the left because of their economic promises. Lower middle class, it's once again about evenly split. You do have, even though you do have the right with the stronger hold, the center really starts to take place here. The upper middle class, it looks like you have the center and the center right, the Republicans, which are the so-called Gaullist party, even though they look like very little what something that would be represented by Charles de Gaulle if he were alive today. But you have the 25% on the ends picking up that, whereas you have the center growing for the upper middle class. And then that's even more exaggerated with a slight bend to the left for the upper class and for the wealthy classes, the privileged, if you will, as it's named on that survey. But we see this We've seen this with the French elections in 2017. We've seen this with the parliamentary elections, subsequently the presidential election in 2022. It always comes down between the center and National Rally, and all the other groups rally around the center. But now you've gotten where the center has collapsed, and this is in the wake of the European Parliament elections, where a lot of the energy has moved towards the left because the center has failed. Macron was supposed to be the man who brings centrism back, supposed to be the man who brings moderate politics back, but his coalition, his strength has collapsed and seemingly given way to a much more, for lack of a better word, radical left. And that now people have coalesced behind one another. And you have a lot of the centrists who are panicking at the potential of a national rally victory or national rally majority where they actually are coalescing with the left. So you are getting these Frankenstein coalitions possibly forming the French legislature of the hard left, of this coalition of left-wing parties under Macron with Macron's ruling party, and Macron once again is still in office. And some speculate that this is going to lead to his early resignation before his term expires in 2027, which he's not eligible for re-election at that point. But some suspect that even in his lame duck term, his failures may force him into resignation. And the way the French system works is a new election is triggered by a resignation. That it's not like the American system where a successor serves out the fixed term. No, it'll trigger an early presidential election in France if that is the case. And like I said, we already saw the dissolution of parliament. We saw the triggering of early parliamentary elections. And either way, even if National Rally doesn't win, which, like I said, despite some of their more compromised issues, I do have my sympathies with, Macron is done. The quote-unquote center of French politics has bottomed out. And it may give way to a left-wing coalition that does include anti-NATO elements, mind you. The French left is still unique in that way for holding some of the more, I guess, quote-unquote, old left positions. And certainly anti-Israel positions in a time like this where, while Macron might pussyfoot around it, ultimately he always comes down on the side of Israel. And that is one of the issues that the right has capitulated on, where in order to avoid certain charges of a certain unforgivable position against a certain group of people, they have to be unapologetically pro-Israel. They have to be behind Likud, that they have to throw their lots in with them. You even see this with Orban. You saw this up until the 2022 war, up until a lot of the dual citizen oligarchs of Russia did flee, that Russia was very friendly with Netanyahu as well, and very friendly with the Israeli state as well. And that's an issue that, yes, the right is compromised on in Europe. Now, how much of that will translate in actual policy versus how much of that will translate into rhetoric? One would hope that it stays more rhetoric than policy and that it is reined in, but who knows? You have a lot of Israeli operatives who work hard to make sure that support from the major Western nations keeps coming, and even the minor Western nations keeps coming as well. So that's probably the biggest concern with the right, even though, like I said, they're promising big things on immigration, but we've seen what big promises look like before, and sometimes they lead to even bigger disappointments. So approach this at the very most the cautious optimism. Like I said, there's a lot of reasons you could have to doubt this, but you shouldn't just throw away everything at face value. You shouldn't just dismiss it saying there's no chance of anything ever improving. Because, look, while it is very much an uphill battle, there still are avenues for advance on our part, on the part of, say, people who might be more sympathetic to our views. It's not going to be a victory every day, but you could say it's worth the chance of possibly making something better. And I'm not saying you need to capitulate on these issues. I'm not saying that you have to be pro-Israel. I'm not saying that you have to hold your tongue while a lot of these parties play along with Israel and do the song and dance. You can criticize them. And hopefully, I don't know, maybe we have the means of public pressure. Speaking in a civic, legal sense, of course, I don't want anything violent or uncouth to happen. Of course not. perhaps there is the mechanism to put public pressure insofar as you still believe in the democratic system. Like I said, perhaps I'm putting too much faith in this, but in terms of any sort of popular action, which, like I said, I know might sound naive, but it's the best we got in order to lean on this or to show that this just simply isn't an issue that sells the public and they might have to shelf that issue. And there's a lot of competing interests there, I understand. I'm not trying to sound like I've roasted in a glass about this. I'm not trying to sound ignorant about this. But I want to have a cautious optimism despite some of my misgivings. But at the very least, I can take joy in the center collapsing in France. And I know, and France is one of the premier countries when it comes to continental European politics. To quote Metternich, France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So let's see what the reverberations of the continent are. And I of course have to say I have been talking a little bit about this. I have to outright say there always is the risk that what happens with Front National is they become the next Brothers of Italy. They become Le Pen becomes the next Maloney, and that it's a complete situation of compromise. But given the track record of National Rally of Front National, it does suggest there are some elements in the party that, let's say, adhere to their old ways a bit more, particularly on the foreign policy issues, and that they might actually, in many ways, resemble what de Gaulle would have wanted when it comes to foreign policy in Europe. Like I said, one can hope. Don't put too much hope in it, but there still is that possibility, and it's probably the best possibility we're going to get in quite some time. And it's also the best possibility that the right has potentially had in decades. So don't put blind faith in it, but don't completely dismiss it outright. Is what I can say. That might not be a satisfactory answer to some, but that's the best I can say given the position. Like I said, I don't want to drum up too much optimism because that just leads to even more bitter disappointment. But like I said, we can't just dismiss everything outright, and we do have to look to see that there might be some avenues for advancement of the way we see the world. And on the other hand, in the UK, there was quite a showing for the Labour Party, as was to be expected, after 14 years since 2010 of failed Labour promises. And there was a schism in the vote, there was a split in the vote. The Conservatives lost a lot of support to the Reform Party. But Labour ultimately dominated. Voter enthusiasm among the Conservatives was low. Labour has actually so far overperformed the exit polls by 1 seat. The Conservatives have underperformed by 10 seats. And the Liberal Democrats have also overperformed by 10 seats as well. Unfortunately, Reform did underperform in terms of seat gathering because the UK is a first past the post system. Whoever wins the plurality of the vote wins the seat. It's not a proportional representation like you see at some points in the continent. And I would say, judging by some election trends, what we've seen on the continent, the proportional system does give more avenues to victory to the right. I could be wrong about that. You can, if somebody knows more, they can correct me about that. But it was encouraging to see the Conservatives suffer the consequences for their actions or lack thereof for the past 14 years. The stalwart defenders of traditional values. Now, I know that maybe I'm comparing the Tories too much to the Republican Party in the U.S., but it's the same center-right mentality you get across the entire Western world, where we're going to stand up to the excesses of the left, but ultimately we're going to push what's a more moderate form and be able to get it through with our conservative presidentials. Oh, you don't mind gay marriage? Look, it's not like we're doing the LGBTQ CIA thing. Oh, you don't mind the LGBTQ CIA thing? At least we're not doing the next radical thing that the left has adopted. Or, oh, you don't mind some legal migration and some illegal migration. At least we're not doing what the left is doing and having completely open borders, even though even that's a lie at that point. But like I said, it's always this constant watered down form of what the left is going to do. And what we've seen right now is the Conservatives have borne the brunt of implementing all these unpopular left-wing policies, so now Labour can sweep in with a historic majority as far as the UK electoral system is concerned, and not only maintain but continue the damage wrought by the Conservatives. It's the constant back and forth. I don't think that'll shock anyone that's the case here. So good when Farage comes out of retirement with his newest political project and takes 14% of the votes from the Conservatives. Good riddance. That's what you people deserve. This is what you deserve for 14 years of incompetence. I don't even want to call it incompetence because that would imply some sort of mistakes being made, as if this wasn't all deliberate, as if they weren't playing their role perfectly. But with the election results, you actually didn't even have a transition period between the two cabinets. Rishi Sunak, this guy who stumbled his way into power somehow after two resignations after Boris Johnson left, after Liz Truss, you remember her? They wanted somebody who looked ethnically British for the Queen's funeral. That's all it was. Before handing it over to a banker of very much non-British descent, very distinctly from the Indian subcontinent, very distinctly not of the British nation. And he saw the not so graceful decline of the Conservatives. He still is in Parliament. He did win his seat, so he'll continue. He's been sacked from leader of the party, and the speculation is now who's going to replace him as leader of the Tories and what direction are the Tories going to take in light of this. Are they just going to double down, continue on the same stale, broken centre-right conservatism, or is there going to be an actual reform within the party? Is this going to lead to actual introspection? I doubt it, because this is the probably pinnacle of controlled opposition parties, and I just hope that we get a few more election cycles of this exact same thing happening, with them getting their vote share taken from the right, and hopefully a real right-wing alternative arising for the British people. And I have to admit the UK is not one of the countries I'm optimistic about. In fact, far from, it's one of the countries I'm probably least optimistic about in the West. Not to disparage any of the British listeners we might have. I wish nothing but the best for your nation, but I can't say, looking at the situation, I have much optimism. I think that continental Europe has better prospects, all things considered. And I would even argue some parts of America might have better prospects. Like I said, I have no ill will at these statements. It's just how I honestly see the situation. And if you have something to the contrary, something that might change my mind, I'm willing to look into that, why there might be more hope for the UK than, say, continental Europe or the United States. I'm open-minded about these things. Please do make the case for it if you believe so. But I really can't say policy-wise much is going to change in the UK, except the current bad policies, the current decay is going to accelerate and intensify. But at this point, it's not even like there was a token opposition, because you can make an argument for some of these useless center-right parties, like the Republicans in the United States, that you do have an avenue with some members of the GOP, with some factions of the GOP, where they can actually serve as a reasonable stumbling block in order for maybe a more right-wing faction, a right-wing coalition, to gather their strengths and push back against this. Now, some might say I sound like a naive fool saying that, and I even feel that way saying it right now. But there is, in my opinion, especially on the local level, especially on the level of local politics, more leeway for that. And I have a lot to say about Trump later and Biden. I'll be getting into that. Don't get me wrong, but good riddance to the Tory government. They brought nothing but 14 years of disappointment, even from this side of the Atlantic. I don't want to imagine what some of our like-minded friends in Britain had to go through for those past 14 years. And I hope, perhaps vainly, that the Labour government isn't that bad, and that, I don't know, maybe you'll resort to some sort of stable, boring center-leftism in order to shore up the legitimacy of the regime. Not that it's ideal, not that it's even good, but it might give you some breathing room. Now, perhaps that could lead to complacency, and perhaps acceleration is the right move. I don't know, but when you actually have to live with the consequences of acceleration, it becomes a much less attractive prospect, as I've seen just in the past 4 years alone. I think as we've all seen in the past 4 years alone. But to continue, like I said, I can't see much really coming from the changing of the guard in the UK. These results were to be expected. It's only about, in terms of seats, about a 60% majority, so they have a healthy majority. They only got about 33% of the vote, so they are governing with a minority of the population's consent. And that's not even considering the amount of the population that turned out for elections in the first place. And like I said, this is assuming the democratic system is good and right and something we should even continue with at this point. But playing by those rules, just assuming that, assuming there's some legitimacy left to the system, then that's what we have to contend with. That's particularly what the British people have to contend with, and I know that these issues are going to reverberate into the rest of the Western world, the rest of the so-called democratic world, including the United States and the current internal political disputes going on with that as well. And because I have hammered on that, I do think now is as good a time as ever to discuss the prospect of Joe Biden and what he is going to do in these next few weeks. Is he even going to remain in office? Is he going to be able to run? And there's a lot of questions given his very poor performance in the debates and the loss of confidence from a lot of the party establishment in the past week and a half. Because the debates were on June 27th. Biden did not look like a man of who was all the way there, that he did have his mental faculties reduced by age and by dementia, is what people have been saying for years. Now they've been written off saying, you're not a medical expert, you can't diagnose that, etc., etc. But anyone who has ever known somebody who unfortunately has succumbed to dementia, I would say, in my amateur opinion, he shows all the signs of it. And this wasn't just a bad night. He didn't just have a cold. He didn't just feel well. It wasn't just he was up past his bedtime. Because as we all know, the President of the United States can only operate from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. He can only operate the hours of a small business, it seems. But even taking all that in consideration, it doesn't suggest this is somebody who has all of his mental faculties. And the media is in an uproar. For their guy, mind you. Because they got to run damage control with him. And he makes it harder and harder every day for them to sweep his mistakes under the rug. See, with somebody like Trump, it's a cycle that works. It's not ideal, but Trump is adversarial towards the media is adversarial towards Trump. They can go head to head. That's good for ratings. That's good for narrative making, especially among the kind of population that they would attract with that. Biden is supposed to be their guy. It's supposed to be Obama 2.0. It's supposed to be the poster boy. It's supposed to be the regime candidate. So the media has to get up there, and they have to whitewash his image. They have to make him look good. They have to make him look like everything they say he is. But he goes out there time and time again, puts his foot in his mouth, and makes it all the more difficult for them to run damage control for this guy. And I think they've had their limit, in which case that's why you've had the media uproar against him, the CNN panels, the MSNBC panels, all the mainstream media coming out and saying, well, maybe it's time for Biden to step down. Maybe it's time for a changing of the guard in the White House. And perhaps there needs to be something done at the Democratic National Convention in order to make sure this man does not stand for another term. Which I think anyone who's being objectively honest about the situation, regardless of any political affiliation, realize that Joe Biden simply does not have the mental faculties to hold even the most basic of employment, let alone political office of any sort, especially the president, especially the quote-unquote highest office in the land, and that under any reasonable circumstances, he would have been removed from office by one means or another by now. Of course, legally speaking, that they would have invoked the 25th Amendment, that they would have invoked some sort of impeachment, or put pressure on him to resign and step down from office. But, of course, there's a lot of people with vested interest in him staying in power. Speculation that his wife, Jill Biden, is pulling the strings, much like a Woodrow Wilson situation after Wilson's stroke. It's speculated his wife was the power behind the power with that. It's speculated that Hunter Biden, his son, the poster boy of controversy, also has a vested interest in him staying in office. And of course, he's Still very close to Obama. Obama still is frequently in Washington, D.C., and frequently consulted by members of the Biden administration. So you have that as well. He's Obama's inside guy, and with somebody like that, it's not like somebody's. Obama wants that elder statesman role. He wants to be the perpetual force in U.S. politics, even if he can't hold the office himself. I don't think that's even conspiratorial or controversial to say. It's somebody who wants to continue his political legacy, especially having been so young when he assumed the office and having quite a few working years ahead of him in order to be able to still influence policy and still be a voice in Washington, be a voice in future administrations. I think that's completely reasonable to say. But of course, the media and even the donor class have turned their ire on Biden. And I know that you've had several donors, particularly the heiress of the Disney Corporation, I believe Abigail Disney it was, came out today and said that she's withholding funds from the Democratic Party, from her family fortune, if they continue to run with Biden until Biden steps aside and gives way to another candidate. The speculated names are Newsom, of course, Kamala Harris, even Michelle Obama has come up. And especially if you buy into the idea that, once again, Obama does have an outsized influence in politics, even post-presidency, that does make sense why we would see her run. And I know it's been speculated for a number of years now since Obama's left office. But just to return to election betting odds, which I think they're a very good source when it comes to predicting these sort of things. For the past week, just to filter by past week, Trump has led the pack in terms of likelihood to be elected the next president at 57.9 over the past week. He's up 0.1% over the previous week. Interestingly enough, for this past week, since the debate, Kamala Harris has been holding steady in second place at 15.3%. And that's an 11.8% increase from what she was previously. Biden is sitting 8.8% lower at a total of 14.7% likelihood according to the betting odds. And then you have Michelle Obama at 4.2, Newsom at 3.3, Bobby Kennedy at 0.9, and then just a few miscellaneous ones, Hillary Clinton, Nikki Haley, etc. But it's really just going to be from the top three of the pack, realistically speaking, unless there is some sort of convention coup that sees Gavin Newsom assume the position as nominee, or perhaps Harris assumes the position because Biden heeds the call of the general public, realizing he is not fit for the office and does step down. And it's not this legalistic way of, I'm going to run for election, but I'll resign as soon as we win re-election and hand the reins over to Kamala because it's her turn, etc., etc. But then that gets to the question of campaign finance law. Like I said, I'm not covering anything that anyone hasn't before here. Can the donations be refunded? Can they be moved to a new candidate? And while I do think, of course, they have back channels for these things, and of course they have little to no regard for campaign finance laws, given how uncertain the situation is electorally and with Trump's possible sentencing, which has been delayed to September 18th, that an act of such open and naked corruption right now is something they cannot afford to do just for the sake of the optics. And I don't know, perhaps there's a way they could refund the campaign donations and then have those funneled back into a new campaign under the new candidate, whoever's decided at the DNC, whether that be Kamala, whether that be Newsom, whether it even be Michelle Obama, whoever it might be that they pick to put up there in order to succeed Biden, because Biden has tarnished his legacy so much. But there also is a sunk cost fallacy here, that they've spent years doing damage control for Biden, that they spent years defending Biden and saying it's fine, and he created so many jobs, he is the president who's won the most votes in American history, etc., etc., where they do have to stick with this guy, or else their own narrative completely crumbles beneath their feet. That they've done so much damage control, that they've run so much interference for him, that they simply can't afford to get rid of him. Because I was thinking a few days ago, I was taken up in the quote-unquote discourse about this, wow, they might actually get rid of him. They might actually force him to resign. They might actually force another candidate to assume the nomination at the DNC. But upon further analysis, like I said, number one, him and his family are just simply too influential within the party. There's too many influential forces backing him. I would say particularly the Obama wing of the party, which would include the Clintons at that point. The Clintons certainly have a vested interest in him staying in power. I believe it was actually Hillary Clinton coming out and saying that, look, Joe just had a bad night. And I know Obama said, oh, everyone has a bad debate night. And I'm pretty sure that Hillary Clinton echoed a similar message. So the movers and shakers of the party, of the internal workings of the party, are behind Biden. The donors are growing frustrated, and the media class is growing frustrated. So that is where the clash of interest comes in. And the question is, does the party old guard, does the vanguard of the party win out, or does the donors and their friends, the media, win out? And that's a difficult question. That's a difficult question because I think the donors, they can talk a big game, but ultimately, who are they going to side with at the end of the day? I know they have the money, they have the influence, but do you think these people have such a vested interest in the Democratic Party are going to threaten to support some neoconservative wing of the Republican Party? Now, maybe under different circumstances where you had a much more compromised Republican candidate than Trump, and I'm not even saying that Trump is the great renegade he once was in 2016 or even 2020. You could see a situation where they defect to the Republican Party, where they do defect to whatever neocon is running, but that's also not an option there. So, while the donors can make these threats, while they can throw their weight around, at the end of the day, they don't really have much options. Same with the media class; they don't really have much of an option, and that I think the party vanguard's probably going to win this one out. Now, who knows? I might be eating my hat in a week to 3 months time when it comes to the election. The fact that they may have replaced Biden, they might be running a much more palatable candidate in order to continue the narrative. Or I don't know, maybe the real schizo take, which I don't think is that much of a schizo take, but it's still a little bit out there, is that Trump is the compromise candidate, and despite the misgivings, despite the adversarial relationship, the institutions, the movers and shakers of the United States are going to throw their support behind him. And I could see that particularly coming from a pro-Israel perspective, that they would want him to do that because he would give them everything they want. He would increase tensions on Iran, even if they did have to make some concessions with Ukraine. Even though I don't think they will get him to make concessions on the Ukraine issue, and even if Trump holds fast to his stated Ukraine position, they're going to pass through the Trump-proof aid packages at some point. They're going to make sure that he cannot easily overturn the aid packages, and that they do have a steady stream of aid going to Ukraine. So, like I said, there's a lot of possibilities here when it comes to that, but I think they're still riding with Biden, to borrow a 2020 anachronism. Because what other choice they have? They've sunk so much into this. Unless Biden does succumb to his own health, which, I mean, physically he seems to be in fine shape, just mentally his faculties are failing. If he's to succumb to that, or just become a complete vegetable who can't even speak at that point, I think they're riding with Biden, and they're going to pull the Chernenko Act and have him propped up, pump him full of whatever medications they need to keep him semi-functional, and that they'll keep puppeteering him for as long as they need to. And while, like I said, I admit that talk of his removal from office did seem plausible earlier on, I'm iffy on that now. I don't know if that can actually be accomplished, and what that would look like going forward as well. And I suppose time will tell, but ultimately I think it's either they're sticking with Biden, or after a certain point they have something on Trump and that they've compromised Trump to some degree where they can use him for their own ends. Like I said, time will tell. I'll need to see more as we get closer to the conventions. I know that the Republican National Convention is in July, the Democratic National Convention is in August. We'll see if they try any pre-convention shenanigans in order to secure the nomination going in. And of course, the DNC is in Chicago this year, so we could see history repeat itself in a way that the Democrats most certainly would not want to see it. And, I mean, especially with the Gaza issue, especially with the ongoing Israel issue, it is going to be even more of a nightmare. But I'm somewhat eager to see what a disaster the DNC is, because I think that'll be a lot of fun. But we'll have to wait about a month and a half before that happens. But don't worry, I'll be keeping you updated on internal party politics news, whatever I can get my hands on until then, and on domestic news, on election news going forward. I'll put up my election prediction map eventually so we can see what that looks like going forward. But I don't want to drag on too long by myself, so I'm just going to round out the show with some Middle Eastern topics, so we'll be getting into those. But probably the biggest news out of the Middle East in this past week and a half is Turkey's sudden plans to withdraw from Syria. So, the lead up to these events was a bit odd, starting on July 1st, but there were anti migrant riots in Turkey after a Syrian migrant allegedly assaulted a woman, actually assaulted an underage girl for that matter, not even a woman. I think she was a teenager. So in response, you had Syrians in the Turkish occupied zones of Syria begin rioting against Turkish occupation forces, burning of Turkish flags. Relatively harmless demonstrations. There wasn't much blood spilled, but the risk of violence was there, and it was starting to intensify, and it has intensified over the past few days. Like I said, you had flag burnings. Now that had escalated to attacking trucks and checkpoints, and Turkey was actually issuing requests to their nationals in Syria not affiliated with the military on the civilian side to begin evacuating Syria because of the escalation of the situation. And mind you, these riots are taking places where the Turkish-backed opposition of the past decade or so has been in control. The Syrian National Army groups like that have been in control. And because of the anti-migrant violence in Syria against ethnic Syrians, against Syrian nationals, you do have them turning on their sponsors. And there were clashes between Syrians and Turks at several of the checkpoints, and then at the same time, Kurdish elements on both sides did try to escalate the situation, getting involved for their own ends, and they put up propaganda showing old airstrikes that Turkey had conducted in Syria, trying to escalate the situation, saying that Turkey was striking Syria. Once again, the regular propaganda techniques that you see employed throughout this. And now you have a further deterioration of the situation where the soldiers have shot several people in Syria, and that you do have drones in the sky over this, and that as a response to all this, you're seeing a complete desire to disconnect themselves from the Syrian issue on both fronts, where you have people in Turkey want the Syrian migrants to, number one, go home, and also want to end the military operation in Syria that Turkey's been conducting since at least 2018. It was earlier than that, but it was mainly the 2018 operation where you have these occupied areas that they want their forces to leave. And I know that you've seen, especially as there has been detente with the Russians from Syria, with the Russians from Turkey on the issue of Syria, that has been back and forth since about 2018, that several plans have been speculated to try to get Turkish forces out of Syria. In fact, Trump actually, when he tried to withdraw from Syria in 2018, he gave more leeway to Turkey in order to operate in Syria. Once again, Turkey caught in the middle of that struggle, particularly in Syria. But it looks like the recent bout of violence and arrest does give more of an excuse for Turkey to begin its withdrawals from the country, and in order to end what at this point is an increasingly unpopular military intervention that has overstayed what welcome it had in the first place, and also a potential to solve this crisis. I know that the idea, at least thrown around, that a lot of the reasons for the occupation zones, these Turkish occupation zones, was for the eventual resettlements of Syrian nationals in to Syria again. But it looks like right now the Syrian nationals, their position is in limbo. You haven't had many statements from the government addressing their fate or what the plan is to repatriate them, but you do have them moving towards a withdrawal from Syria. And that is also as Turkey is reopening diplomatic and economic channels with Iran, particularly on the issue of energy and oil. So After a 4-year hiatus, according to Eurostat, Turkey has re-implemented the importation of Iranian oil, despite U.S. sanctions. And as of March 2024, Turkey has imported 576 metric tons of oil from Iran, following another 485 metric tons in April, which marks a significant shift after having shut down in August 2020 when they stopped importing it altogether under pressure from U.S. sanctions. And now that we've seen 2 years of U.S. sanctions completely backfire, you have more countries willing to flaunt them. You have more countries willing to cast them to the side under these considerations, and the resumption of oil imports is not only from Turkey, but you also have EU states such as Bulgaria participating in this, where they've raised their imports by 113% compared to the previous year, and even Poland, which is rapidly becoming the new U.S. base of operations in NATO, has increased their imports from Iran for the first time in 2 years. Iranian oil exports have surged in recent months, and it's about 1.6 million barrels per day in some months 2023 and this year in 2024, which compared to record lows in 2019 was 300,000 barrels per day. And that was when you had Trump beginning the campaign of quote-unquote maximum pressure against Iran. And since 2019, just in 5 years, we've seen how seriously countries take U.S. sanctions now. And Turkey, being the ultimate middleman in this part of the world when it comes to both Europe and Middle Eastern politics, they've opened what might be a quite literal floodgate right now. And the Europeans aren't going to ask many questions. They're desperate for energy. So they're going to continue, whether directly or indirectly, to import Iranian energy if they can. Because, number one, it fulfills the goal of getting them, quote-unquote, off Russian energy. Number two, it puts gas in their tanks. It keeps their homes fueled. It keeps their homes warm. It keeps the power grid on. All the things that you need to run a modern industrial society. And they're not going to turn that down just out of sheer pragmatism at that point. And even if they do have to cooperate with the Iranians. Because Europe's prospects are limited, and truthfully, when it comes to European energy, they're getting it from Russia by third-party channels, or from the Middle East by third-party channels. And I know the Saudis have, of course, been cutting oil production as well in conjunction with Russia, which has led to a rise in global prices, which has once again screwed over the Europeans, who are completely dependent on, more or less completely dependent on foreign energy. And I know you could talk about nuclear power, but you have to consider where they even get their nuclear fuel from, which comes mostly at this point, well, I shouldn't say mostly, but significantly from Russia. There are other sources, Australia, Canada, West Africa, which I know after the Niger coup last year does present some problems that imports haven't exactly recovered, and that there is still some hamstringing of importing of nuclear fuel and other raw resources from Africa, or even, say, through China, which has also invested a great deal in the development of Africa and still has very strong trade relations with the West. So the Europeans are getting their energy from foreign sources anyway, and it's inevitable that the Iranians were going to get in on that market, especially now that you have Biden, who at least on paper takes a more conciliatory stance towards the Iranians versus Trump. And that's probably one thing, if Trump does come back into office, that he will crack down on, is the violation of sanctions related to Iran, especially with the current issues in Israel right now, that they can't afford to have more money being pumped into Iran. That, number one, not only is it bad from just brass tacks, from the fact that it gives the Iranians more money and more leverage to work with, but number two, it's just optically bad. We're going to have the maximum pressure campaign, which is what he constantly drummed on about in 2019, 2020. You can't have that when you have NATO countries, when you have European countries cooperating with the Iranian energy market. Especially, I would say Poland is probably the most damning one out of all of those, which is supposed to be the steadfast U.S. ally, supposed to be our bulwark against Russia, importing oil from a quote-unquote Russian ally at that point. And, like I said, it makes fools of the American empire, which I think is just the overarching theme of the past 4 years under the particularly Biden administration. I mean, but there was even some of that under Trump, but at least, I don't know, people feared that Trump had the guns to back it up, particularly when it came to Middle Eastern issues. So the Iranian issue was, I guess you could say, frozen over, that it wasn't really getting any better or any worse at that point. But these trends will probably continue, and even if Trump gets back into office, depending on how much force he has thrown around, depending on how much both soft and hard power the U.S. has to expend, we could very easily see a situation where the Europeans and Turkey, as well as other so-called U.S. allies, continue their imports in spite of threats from Washington. Because at this point, half the world is under sanctions. They mean less and less. The more you use them, the less they mean. And you're creating economic blocks that completely exclude the United States now. And I know I was talking about BRICS earlier. I know that you can say a lot of things about BRICS, but point being is alternative economic blocks to the prevailing system are currently growing. And you can't dispute that. Whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, you can't dispute that. And that will continue as the U.S. tries to exercise more and more hard power when it comes to economic sanctions and, of course, military force. It's going to look like less and less of a legitimate leader on the world stage when it has to employ more and more heavy-handed tactics. And that's the problem we've been running into time and time again. But we'll return to that when we get more news in the coming week or so on next episode. But I just do want to briefly finish out with an update around Israel. So, a frontline update in the north of Gaza Strip. Fighting is taking place in Al Juaida. Israeli artillery struck several areas in Gaza, and of course the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate for more civilian casualties, more secondary effects also leading to civilian casualties as well, such as lack of uh, food, water, healthcare infrastructure, etc. That you are getting a lot of secondary deaths from these causes. Uh, there has been raids by Israeli forces into the West Bank, and the talk of expanded annexations within the West Bank, and that you had clashes between settlers and local Arabs in the West Bank. So, as some feared, escalation may be moving into there. They may be moving their operations to continue their policy towards the part of Palestine that is still under the governing of the Palestinian Authority, which Israel, quote unquote, is technically supposed to recognize, which recognizes the state of Israel and is committed to the two-state solution, at least on paper. So we could see more escalation in the West Bank as Israel grows more desperate with the situation in Gaza. But I think most pertinently is the situation in Lebanon. Hezbollah has carried out one of the most aggressive attacks it has since the beginning of this conflict. And that is 17 IDF targets have been hit, with 9 more border bases and settlements also being attacked just over the course of the past day. Like I said, as of now, I'm recording on July 5th, 2024. It'll probably be July 6th, 2024 by the time this is up. And after all of that, Netanyahu and his war effort grow more and more unpopular. You have fears of further intervention in Lebanon. You have several countries across the world calling to evacuate their citizens, calling to evacuate the diplomatic personnel from Lebanon, and that Israel is going to push north and that they're going to take on Hezbollah because it's, at least the way they see it, it's a now or never prospect that they're either going to dislodge Hezbollah from Lebanon or they're going to lose their opportunity to altogether. Which, once again, from the Israeli perspective, I do think is a reasonable take. But is going to be more trouble than it's worth. 2006 was deadly enough. And they've lost magnitudes more men in Gaza than they have in 2006, and they haven't seen the same level of protest. Now, you have seen demonstrations against Netanyahu, but they're usually ineffective or shut down pretty quickly because of the quote-unquote wartime restrictions, and that Netanyahu, by every definition of the word, is operating like a dictator right now, and the minute he steps down from power, he's almost certainly going to end up in a cell. If there is some sort of revolution against him, there's some sort of color revolution or coup against him under the most extreme circumstances, the next succeeding government is probably going to throw him in jail for the corruption charges they were trying to get on before. Plus, there's likely, I don't know the intricacies of Israeli law, but there's likely many instances of abuse of power he's exercising right now since October 7th, since he seized the powers of the war cabinet. And I know the war cabinet has been dissolved, but since he seized more expansive powers in light of the outbreak of war in the Gaza Strip. So his days might be numbered, and who knows what will come after him? I know that people keep saying that about Netanyahu. I think he'll still probably be able to hold on for quite some time. And I think what he's banking on right now is Trump getting reelected. And love or hate Trump, that is one of the big pitfalls. His how much he is attached to the hip of, particularly the Likud party in Israel, and of course the influence of Kushner and uh, that faction of the Trump family, who also have very strong connections to the Likud party and Israel. And you have the Trump interviews, I believe they were from March of this year, April of this year, where he's saying, well, Israel needs to finish the conflict, needs to do what it needs to do, so we can shut this case, so the situation can stop escalating. A lot of people, at first, the way Trump said it, interpreted as Trump coming out against Israel and telling them to stop the campaign. But more or less, he was telling them to clean this up fast because we can't afford to do this forever. Which, I mean, just speaking in very frank terms, is true, yes. But it isn't exactly the solution to the conflict that I think a lot of people would like. And Netanyahu is going to continue grasping on power for as long as he can. Like I said, I'm retreading a lot of what I've said previously here because it is worth repeating. But who knows what the potential intervention in Lebanon will yield? Will this lead to more Israeli immigration from the north? More Israeli immigration altogether? Because a large reason why they're conducting this operation is that the Jews in northern Israel don't feel secure in their position. They feel they're too vulnerable to attack from Hezbollah and other Iranian aligned groups. So the Israelis need to conduct a military operation in order to ensure their security, or at least sense of security. But at the same time, you've had since October 6th roughly 60,000 people leave northern Israel, either leaving the country altogether or relocating to other parts of Israel. So it's a situation where they don't really have much choice if they want to continue with the stated goals that they have, which Netanyahu is a maximalist about this, and the people he's surrounded himself with go even further about this, where they want a, pardon the term, but it's really the best thing I can think of, they want a permanent solution to the Palestinian conflict. They want to see them either completely subjugated or expelled altogether, and it seems like that's the only solution they're going to accept, that interest for any sort of negotiation simply is not going to remain in any real sense. And I think even under the circumstances in which Netanyahu's government collapses, and even if he doesn't face legal charges, even if he goes back to civilian life or flees the United States or whatever, and you get, I don't know, some sort of labor Zionist coalition coming into power, the situation, in my opinion, between Israel, the Palestinians, and the region as a whole is so irreparably damaged, even a more quote unquote peace-minded government couldn't salvage this situation. But once again, only time will tell. I don't foresee it getting better though. But that is all I had. Thank you all for being with me on this solo episode. Hopefully we can get GSP back soon, or in the meantime, hopefully I can get some other people to come on the show and bring in their perspective. I hope you all enjoyed this, despite the fact that it was mostly me monologuing. Hopefully I didn't get too caught up on any one particular issue. I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say, certainly. And we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.